Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Buck Institute for Education. I'm Suzie Boss and I'll be your guide for about the next hour. Our focus today is on project-based learning and service learning, two strategies for meaningful learning that just belong together. More about that in a minute, but first let me introduce myself. I'm a member of the National Faculty of the Buck Institute for Education. I'm the co-author of a book called Reinventing Project-Based Learning, and I write regularly for Edutopia. I've also helped to develop service learning projects for national organizations, so I've seen firsthand the benefits that can happen when young people get engaged with their communities. Before we dig in, let's cover a couple logistics. You'll see a chat window on your screen where you can ask questions or make comments during today's event. If you use Twitter, join the back channel today. Just add the hashtag PBLchat to your comments. And for follow-up questions or comments after we wrap up, please join me on Edmodo. You'll see on your screen the URL for this PBL community that the Buck Institute for Education has launched on Edmodo. It's a very active community with many members, and I'll be posting resources and links there today. Now let's dive in. Sometimes service learning can look like the picture that you see on your screen. This is a shot from a high school project called Studio H. The project tagline is Design, Build, Transform. And that's exactly what students have been doing in their rural community in North Carolina. For their culminating project last year, they designed and built just a beautiful facility for a new farmers market, which they then turned over to the community to run. Why a farmers market? Well, it's a strategy that addresses some real issues. By creating a market for fresh produce, students expect to improve local eating habits and turn around some high-risk health trends that are affecting their families. So this project involves some serious problem solving, as well as creativity, collaboration, and other important skills. How did the community respond? When the project was completed, the mayor gave these kids the key to the city. All in all, that's a pretty amazing outcome. Sometimes, despite best intentions, community service turns into a mad scramble to fill hours. As this quote from the New York Times points out, assigning students to fulfill hours of service is no guarantee of a quality experience, not for kids and not for communities. Some students even resent community service if it starts to feel like compulsory volunteering. So that brings us to today's driving question. How can we transform community service hours into service learning projects? Let's tackle our driving question by starting with what we need to know. Here are 4 questions that will be shaping our discussion today. First, why is service learning worth doing and worth doing well? How do we connect the dots between PBL and service learning? How can we use the 3 A's, which we'll define in a little bit? Want to get you wondering about those for now. And how might we get inspired by examples and resources? Let's start with a look at the service learning landscape. About a quarter of K-12 schools and universities have some kind of service program, along with about half are community colleges. So service learning is widespread, reaching 35 states in a huge range of student ages. Your school, your district, or your state may have its own service learning requirements. Some models, such as the International Baccalaureate or New Tech Network, incorporate community service requirements. Why do we have such an emphasis on service learning? The Corporation on National and Community Service, in its research brief, points to 3 important ways that students benefit from this kind of learning. They have identified academic engagement and achievement gains, improvement in civic attitudes and behaviors, and social and personal skills that students develop. These add up to good preparation for citizenship, for college, for careers, really for life. But these kinds of benefits are not automatic. It takes a quality service learning experience to deliver these advantages. We want all students to enjoy the benefits. So what do we do? Here's the key. High quality service learning puts equal emphasis on both sides of this equation, service plus learning. The National Service Learning Clearinghouse gives us a little bit more expanded definition. They tell us that service learning is a teaching and learning strategy that integrates meaningful community service with instruction and reflection to enrich the learning experience, teach civic responsibility, and strengthen communities. Here's another way to think about it. If you send students out to pick up trash, they might be doing community service. They might even be making a difference in their communities in the short run. But are they thinking critically about the causes of pollution? Are they thinking creatively to design solutions? Probably not. Now picture the same students analyzing what gets thrown away in their neighborhood, researching options for local recycling, developing a public education campaign that winds up diverting tons of materials from the landscape. Now that's making a difference. That's service learning. If you've taken part in workshops offered by the Buck Institute for Education in the past, or perhaps done some self-study with BIE books or online resources, you will recognize this graphic. It captures the 8 essential elements that every project needs. We're not going to go into all 8 elements today, but if these elements are new to you, you can learn more about them by going to bie.org and taking a look at the resources and materials there. When it comes to service learning projects, all 8 elements are essential. Think of service learning projects as a subset of PBL. It is project-based learning, but there's a different emphasis than in other kinds of projects. In service learning projects, student learning follows an arc from kickoff to final event with active inquiry-based learning in between, just as it happens in all project-based learning. The culminating event or product, though, in service learning tends to be something that benefits a community or improves quality of life in some way. A few PBL elements are especially important in service learning projects. The K-12 Service Learning Standards for Quality Practice were developed by the National Youth Leadership Council. And I'm going to tell you about 4 of those in particular that align very nicely with what we know about effective PBL. Here's where we connect the dots. Let's take a look. First is youth voice. To maximize engagement, students need to have a say in designing service learning projects. Just as important is the link to the curriculum. Service learning projects align with academic learning goals. What's more, projects give students opportunities to apply knowledge in very authentic ways. In project-based learning, we typically emphasize in-depth inquiry. That's what PBL is all about, and it's also what quality service learning projects are all about. They have duration and intensity. That means they give students extended opportunities to investigate community needs, take action, and reflect on their learning and impact. Those things just can't happen in a one-day or short-term event. Finally, good service learning projects emphasize reflection. Reflection needs to happen throughout the project so that students get the benefit of thinking deeply about what they're accomplishing and why it matters. Along with these essential elements, service learning projects also need to be age appropriate. And as we talk about some examples coming up, we'll talk a little bit in more detail about different kinds of projects that you might do at different grade levels. In project-based learning, we often talk about starting with the end in mind. That's a good plan when designing service projects also as well. So what should students know or be able to do by the end of a project? Here are 3 authentic outcomes to keep in mind. I call them the 3 A's: awareness, advocacy, action. Let's find out a little bit more about each of these. In service projects that lead to awareness, students learn about something that's significant. Then they make sure others get informed also. Students in Portland, Oregon recently researched the contributions of 15 local civil rights leaders, dating way back to the 1960s. 2 of these people had been freedom riders during the 60s who challenged segregation. Now, students were quite moved by what they learned through their oral histories, and they wanted to raise others' awareness as well. So they created a traveling museum exhibit, which you see these students showcasing a piece of that exhibit here. Just a wonderful project. When students become advocates, they speak up for those who don't have a voice. They might advocate for a group of people, for a place that needs protection, or even perhaps animals that are endangered. Here's a great advocacy project from students at High Tech High in San Diego who advocated for better environmental quality at their favorite public beaches. The project was called Media Saves the Beach. Sometimes students are so motivated by what they've learned that they want to take action. They want to go beyond raising awareness and do something, make something happen. Wetlands Watchers are middle school students from Louisiana who've become very active stewards of their local watershed. Their efforts led to a tract of land being protected and actually developed as a park. It includes an outdoor classroom where students now teach others about the importance of the wetlands. So these students have turned their concern into civic action that really benefits the whole community. When students are launching service learning projects, help them think about where their project might go, what might be the logical outcome of their project. They may say that they want to make a difference. That can be kind of hard to define. So help them focus their project by asking them if their goal is really to raise awareness, to speak up for someone, or perhaps to take action. All of these are very important, authentic roles and great outcomes for projects to lead toward. Now, sometimes projects manage to hit more than one of these A's. More Than That is the title of a project done by some high school students from the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. Students watched a documentary that portrayed Native American communities in a negative light, and they decided that they needed to deliver a counter message. They didn't think that this nationally broadcast documentary about Native Americans told their story very well. So they told their own story. They created a video called More Than That that raises awareness in simple but powerful scenes like the one you see here. Students use their bodies as billboards to convey words that they think do a better job of revealing who they really are. Words like family, bravery, intelligence, humor, honor. YouTube hits for this video were up to nearly 60,000 this week and growing quickly after NPR picked up their story and kind of made it go viral. But that's not where this project ends. Awareness certainly was a big goal here. Students were advocating actually for themselves, but then they took action. They recently traveled to Washington, D.C. to speak to national organizations and lobby their congressional delegation for better funding. So they've become advocates and activists who are speaking up for themselves and their community, all through this interesting, wonderful project. So how can you start planning meaningful service projects for your students? Where do ideas like this come from? Let's look at a few sources of inspiration. Great service projects often start with academic content. Now here's an example of students who were motivated by a work of literature and wound up launching an awareness campaign. They first read a novel called Sold, which tells the story of a young girl who was trafficked. Their teacher, Shelley Wright, is someone who regularly encourages her students to apply what they're learning for authentic, real-world purposes. Learning doesn't just stop at the classroom doors in her case. She wants to make sure students take what they learn and put it to use in the world. So when her students read this book, they wanted to know more about modern-day slavery. As they realized that it continues to be a problem in the world today, they just felt motivated to speak up. They created a social media campaign which enabled them to write and use technology for an authentic purpose, one that they were very passionate about. Now this is kind of a gritty topic that wouldn't be appropriate for younger students, but academic content can often be the springboard for service projects with younger kids. I remember talking with an elementary media specialist who had introduced her fifth graders to a book called The Family Apart. It tells the story of the orphan train, real-life story about the train relocated homeless and abandoned children back in the 1800s. Students were moved by the story and also curious. They wanted to know what happens to homeless children today. So they did research, they inquired, found out about what was going on in their own community, and they decided to do a service project to benefit a local shelter for homeless families. This wasn't something that was planned at the start of the project, but their teacher was wise enough to listen to students' questions and let them take their learning as far as they wanted to go with it. Here's another example of using core academics as the launching pad for service learning. In this case, these are students in Minnesota, and the story is from a great website called What Kids Can Do, whatkidscando.org. Great site to look for to get some examples and inspiration of service projects. In this case, students are helping nonprofit organizations and government agencies by consulting on issues that require some expert thinking. So these students are pretty skilled mathematicians, and they partner with local organizations to identify issues, figure out a research plan, gather data, make recommendations based on their analysis. For students, this is a chance to apply pretty advanced math concepts to real-world issues. The partner organizations get the benefit of expertise that their own staffs may not have, and this expertise helps them go far toward meeting their mission. Again, you might be thinking, but my students aren't expert mathematicians yet. They're a little younger than this. Well, there are ways that younger students can offer themselves as consultants as well. Let me tell you about some middle school students and how they helped with a project for Habitat for Humanity. When a new home was being built in their community by Habitat for Humanity, students wanted to get involved. But they didn't want to just show up and volunteer. They offered themselves up as consultants. They started by calculating the area of interior walls that needed to be painted. They figured out how much paint should be needed for the job, and then they compared their projections with what would be a typical paint order for a project like this. They found out that there's a fair amount of waste in projects like this. Volunteer painters, it turns out, can be a little bit messy and sometimes spill a lot of paint. So students developed a training program to increase the efficiency of volunteers, and when it was time for students to pick up a paintbrush, they put themselves through their own training methods and worked very efficiently. So think of your students as consultants taking their expertise into the world, and you never know kind of where they may wind up helping or who they may help through their efforts. Some service projects start with more direct engagement with community partners. Some schools will have a point person or a service learning team for developing partnerships, and local nonprofit organizations come to think of the school as a great resource for them. So here's an example of a very popular service learning project that puts elementary and middle school students in the role of community philanthropists. It's called the Penny Harvest, and it starts with students going on a penny drive to round up spare change. Now, pennies are pretty democratic. You can find them across all socioeconomic strata. Every neighborhood has pennies. So students go out, gather up pennies, and the first part of the project involves gathering, counting, graphing, maybe estimating the value of these pennies, lots of math connections there. But then things get a little more interesting. Students do some research to figure out what it is about their neighborhood that they would really like to improve. What would they like to fix or make better or beautify? Then they invite nonprofit organizations that are involved in local issues. They set up philanthropy roundtables where adults from these nonprofits are invited in to kind of explain themselves. What are their programs doing? How could they benefit from a grant from these student philanthropists? And students sometimes will ask tough questions about, how does program success get measured, and how do we know that our contribution will be well spent? So adults wind up taking students quite seriously. Students also find out that small contributions can add up to big change. Since 1991, their grants have totaled more than $8 million. Some students are so inspired by this experience that they go on to tackle additional service projects to enhance their neighborhoods. For them, this is just kind of the start on a long engagement with their communities. Another source of inspiration for service projects is what I have come to call ripped from the headlines projects. Now, you may have students who will just be inspired by the news. There may be a natural disaster or another event in their community or somewhere else in the world, and they feel compelled to respond. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, or the devastation in Haiti, or the tsunami in Japan, we've all seen students, wanting to step up, wanting to do something. So encourage your students to think critically about what they might accomplish and how they could best use their skills and their understanding and their energy to assist. Help them turn their empathy into a service learning project. Here's an example of a project that grew out of a tragic event. There was a hate crime in a neighborhood that resulted in the death of an immigrant from Ecuador. Students wanted to send a message after this happened to the victim's family. They wanted to kind of heal their community, and they really wanted to send the message that hate has no place at their school or in their community. So as part of a long-term project to really change the climate, they created a mosaic. You see a little bit of it here. It was just one step in building a more inclusive, welcoming community. And you can see lots more examples of projects like this, of how schools are standing up to intolerance, on a social media site called Not in Our Town. It's NIOT.org. It's just a terrific site, and you will see not only lots of other service learning projects there, but you'll find resources to kind of help plan projects like this if it's something that your school wants to take a lead on. Like others effective service learning projects, Not in Our Town encourages student voice and the other elements of high quality service projects. I hope that these examples are giving you some new ideas about what students can accomplish through service learning. But I'm not going to pretend that it's all easy. You may be starting to think about, how am I going to manage the complexity of projects? I'm imagining projects where students are going to be outside the classroom. How am I going to keep track of what's going on? These are fair questions. Communication is key in service learning projects. You'll want to take advantage of tools that will help your students learn to manage their own efforts. Project logs, like the sample that you see here, and which you can download from the BIE.org site. These sorts of tools help students think about the specific tasks involved in their project. They help students break down, a big project into manageable chunks, manageable goals. Who's going to do what, when. Simple trackers like these help students plan ahead, turn big challenges into manageable milestones. And they also help you identify challenges early so that as the facilitator, you can help students make adjustments and overcome challenges if they should arise. We talked earlier about the importance of reflection throughout a service learning project. Reflection journals, project blogs, informal check-ins, these are all useful for encouraging students to think about what they're learning, to think about what's hard, and to ask for help if they need it. So you want to be deliberate about checking in and checking in often with your students. You'll also want to vary the reflection questions that you ask so that you prompt students in ways that keep them interested and keep them reflecting. So be deliberate about project management, and again, at the BIE.org site, you'll find some other resources to help you with project management. Planning ahead can also help you avoid some pitfalls when it comes to service learning. Now, the photo that you see here is from a public event having to do with the UN Millennium Development Goals. It reminds me that worthy goals can seem overwhelming. Solving a huge issue like poverty or hunger is just more than your students can expect to achieve in a project. They may aspire to a goal like ending hunger or eradicating poverty, but you want to help them keep projects right size so that they don't feel overwhelmed. You want them to enjoy some success with their project. So manageable goals, right-size project, those are good to think about in the beginning. If you're working with community partners, there may be some educating that you need to do to help your partners understand what effective service learning is all about. When organizations start to partner with students in authentic service learning projects, they may find that some of their traditional volunteer roles need to change a little bit. Some schools wind up developing contracts with the organization, service contracts, so that you agree in advance kind of what the role of students will be, what sorts of check-ins might be happening, how will we measure success together. All those sorts of questions are good to talk about in the beginning. Another pointer on the preparation for challenges topic is making an effort to make service learning projects a priority in your school community and not an afterthought. Many schools have maybe one or two teachers who really are kind of known for leading the charge when it comes to service learning. But there are opportunities across the curriculum. So if you can kind of be public about the projects that you're doing with your students, that's going to be helpful for spreading the word that service learning projects have a place, across campus, not in just one teacher's classroom or not for just a particular grade level. So make it a priority. Share the wealth of your knowledge as you learn more from doing this. And encourage your students to be public about what they're doing. Finally, you want to assess projects for the quality of the learning experience and not the hours served. As with any good project, you're going to want to let students know in advance how their efforts will be assessed. What are the goals that you're aiming for? Service learning projects offer good opportunities for students to develop and practice those 21st century skills that we talk about so often, things like collaboration, critical thinking, and communication. You'll find sample rubrics to help you assess all of these real-world skills on the BIE.org site. There are just a wealth of resources and materials to help you learn more about service learning and get ideas for great projects. Here are just a few of the many organizations that are out there. Some of them I've mentioned today already. I'll be posting links to these along with some other resources for you on Edmodo. So take a look there and please chime in with your own resources that you recommend to your fellow educators. So we're going to open up for questions in a minute, but first I want to encourage you to reflect on your own thinking about service learning. So I'm going to ask you in a minute to jot down your own reflection, to your own answer to this question. What do you hope your students will remember? What will they take away from a service learning project? When they look back as young adults, what are they going to remember about the service learning that unfolded? So to capture your reflection, I've created a wall on WallWisher. It's a place where you can go and post your reflection and see what others are thinking about this topic. If you haven't used WallWisher before, now's your chance to give it a try. It's a great little tool for sharing reflections, or can be used for brainstorming, lots of other ways. There's no login required. You just need to go to the URL that you see here. Click to open a sticky note and then write your reflection on that note. And I'll look forward to kind of hearing your comments after we wrap up today. So now's our chance to take a few questions. I'm going to be taking a look at the chat and Twitter and see what your questions are. I see that someone is asking, is it better to do a single class project, service learning project, or do something school-wide? That's a great question, and I'm going to hedge a little bit because I've seen great examples both ways. It can be successful as a school-wide effort where the whole school community comes together, so it can be a really great culture-building experience for the whole school to be involved in a project together. On the other hand, one classroom can go really far by designing and thinking about a particular inquiry that they really care about, a cause that they're committed to. So there's not a single right answer to this, but I guess I would encourage you to think about your own comfort level. Start small if you're new to PBL or if you're new to service learning, and kind of build on your successes. So I hope that makes sense. Another question here is, about a STEM focus. You know, our school has a STEM focus. Are there service learning opportunities there? Well, I think that's a STEM, you know, the fields of science, technology, engineering, and math are just a rich area to think about service learning applications, service learning projects. Anything that has to do with data gathering and analysis, or designing solutions, designing real things, perhaps building them, as we saw at the start of this webinar with Studio H and its design focus. Those can be real world opportunities to have some meaningful learning. In particular, I've seen some wonderful design projects come out of the challenge to have students address the UN Millennium Development Goals in some way. How might you use technology to solve a real problem, you know, that relates to these goals? There's some great opportunities for STEM projects out there. So I hope you'll share what you're doing with STEM service learning projects, as I think there's a lot we all can learn from each other there. And before we close, I wanted to just kind of give a shout out to an event, about an event that's coming up this summer. PBL World, co-hosted by the Buck Institute for Education, is going to be taking place in Napa, California. It's a chance to dive much more deeply into project-based learning best practices and to learn with colleagues from across the country. It's coming up in June, and I know I plan to be there. So if you're there too and you'd like to talk more about service learning projects in person, I would be delighted to join you in that conversation. So finally, I wanted to share my contact information. Feel free to send me an email if you have questions about today, or connect with me on Twitter. I'm easy to find there. And I look forward to continuing our conversation on Edmodo, and I really look forward to hearing from you about the service learning projects that you're designing with your students and the wonderful outcomes that you're seeing. So thanks very much for your time today, and I'll see you online.